As promised, today I'll be looking at why defense supply chains are so bloody complicated. So, uh, defense firm supply chains, as I've said, they go far beyond military grade products, but for today, I'm just going to be focusing on purely the military grade products. So, uh, defense firms, by their nature, have supply chains. Every firm has a supply chain, but I would say that for defense, supply chains are inherently more complicated than in other industries uh, for a number of reasons, and so it's important to understand them. I think if one's going to be looking at this sort of technology, and we are going to focus on goods rather than services today, because services is inherently for supply chains significantly more complex and I had an impulse to say configurable there, but I won't. Changeable. So, every firm wants supply chain security, but in defense, supply chains are tricky. They are really, really tricky. And so you've really got to be on top of them. And so defense firms have very, very good supply chain management departments. Very good at their work. So, first off, any defense project requires a lot of different types of technology. As with, most government work or contracting to the government or contracting on large projects, this is really the extreme end of large projects. So if we're looking at something like a missile, it has several component parts. Each component part will have several component parts of its own, which will require loads and loads of different raw materials, which again increases or expands the supply chain. So if one looks at how it works, even for sort of the final product of a missile up here, you have many, many, many different branches. And it effectively, if you start up here, it begins to look a bit like a family tree. It just continues to split off and split off and split off. And so there's a lot of variables involved. And that's just for something like a missile, let alone if we're looking at something like a strike fighter or an aircraft carrier. And obviously that requires a lot of raw materials that can be affected by, I guess you'd say, contemporary in general. It can be through a lifetime or situational circumstance. So that's something to consider. Secondarily, often they require a lot of cooperation with other firms and national organizations as well. So military equipment is made or sort of made known to be designed through government contracts. I can't go out and buy a tank. I can't go out and get a Challenger 2, rather unfortunately. You can't go out and get a Challenger 2. And that is rather the way it is. Although, actually, this is a bit of a side note. I know I'm getting sidetracked, but apparently you can buy the Alvis Stormer for like £19,000, and you can drive them. They're road legal, so it's a bit of a trade-off. More fuel expenditure, a lot for your vehicle, but you'd get armor and air defense, so something to consider. Anyway, I really am getting sidetracked. For anything being sold, it's being sold to a government, meaning there is a bidding process, there is competition, and it's not merely competition within the marketplace, as you'd see with other firms. You're sort of competing for market share, as it were. It's rather structural. That doesn't mean it's not exciting, but there is an in-place structure in order to determine who gets a contract, who gets to bid, who has the proper authority, the proper licensing. And that's pretty essential, meaning there's a lot of sort of other firms involved. If I am making an aircraft carrier, I am not making everything on that aircraft carrier. If I'm making a missile, likely I'm going to employ either technology, which will be, I guess you'd say, proprietary technology of another firm. If I'm sort of building upon it, I may be using certain component parts that are proprietary technology. Or if I'm building something like a ship, I'm just using a lot of different firms' parts in itself. So, BAE Systems may, or let's say for Babcock's new Type 31 frigate, they may have the contract, but nonetheless, BAE owns Bofors. So the cannons that are going to be equipped on it, it's going to require cooperation with BAE, and that's just sort of on a macro level. It goes far deeper than that. So there's a lot of coordination that is inherently required, and a lot of technologies from other firms that are necessary and often included in contract specifications. So a lot of coordination and organisation is required. Also, there's a lot of R&D involved, so that's research and development, which means there is a lot of initial investment. There's a lot of putting money necessarily into developing certain products, necessarily buying certain resources in order to develop products, which costs a lot of money. If you're to look at something like Brimstone 2, I think cost 370 or 380 million pounds to develop. That's not a small investment. And if you have other products which perhaps don't get to the stage of Brimstone, they do require investment. If they then go void effectively and can't be passed on, as I said sort of with the last video, you're the last one holding the parcel. It's a larger loss for the firm because that is effectively permanent stock after it's had a lot of money invested into it. And that then has to be disposed of through very complex means or repurposed. But in any case, it's not necessarily just as simple as linear, make product, sell product. It's far more complex than that because there are these official competitions and a limited and very specific market. And that makes it fairly complicated. So also you have a very, very long sales process. If you look at the manner in which this sort of works before someone gets a contract, it's a very, very long and complex and rigorous process, as it should be. But there's a lot of administrative stuff to go through because it's a massively high capitalization deal. So if you were to look at any other deal in any other industry that was dealing with the same sort of capitalization as you might see with, I'm not quite sure how much they cost, 1.23 billion pound Type 26 frigate, it's not going to be equivalent in any way, shape or form. But nonetheless, if you were doing a 1.23 billion pound deal anywhere else, that would require a lot of initial investment. It would require lawyers. It would require external firms in order to get it through. It requires a lot. So I think people do need to look at each one of these. If I or the MOD buys 5 1.23 billion pound Type 26 frigates, that is a market capitalization of 6 point, we'll say 25 roughly, not quite that, but 6.25 or a bit less odd billion pounds. That's a huge deal, and that's something that really has to be looked at with scrutiny. So high capitalization deals and a long sales process make the process even more complex. Moreover, you've got the involvement of international law, and this is something that I hadn't really considered too much, shockingly. There is a lot of international law legislation around the distribution, production, manufacture, collaboration. It can only occur in a certain way, and that actually, there's the underlying international law, and then there's law that changes as you enter various territories. So you really do have to be careful with the supply chain itself and how it operates fundamentally. And obviously there's a lot of regulation for very good reason. The law gets involved a lot. And there are certain military technologies that may have to be transported in a special manner, have special considerations, meaning one's got to go through certain administrative pathways. It's rather bureaucratic in some ways, one could even argue. And this isn't even to mention the sort of tedious paperwork that comes along with all of this stuff, the manpower it takes in order to organize the legal side, the distribution side, that sort of thing. It's a massive organizational feat. Also, we've got clear deadlines, orders that need to be fulfilled in a certain amount of time, otherwise a lot of people are going to be very unhappy. And obviously there are outliers to this. but there are deadlines that are, really more certain than a lot of other industries. There are hold-ups, there are delays, as you'd see with any really, really enormous organizational feat or enormous organizational process. But nonetheless, what we see is it's really quite strict in regard to when certain parameters have to be met, how certain parameters have to be met, how something has to be made. The parameters are preset often and set in stone once that occurs. So it's more limited than one might think, and for good reason, because regulation is necessary for an industry that makes products as the defense industry does. You've got, in addition to this, for general supply chain management, anyone who knows the sort of theory, it means one can't employ the more classical sort of stock out strategy. So what that is as we've sort of moved on, the modern management method for supply chains, or at least the management of stock logistically, as opposed to in regard to supply chains, you maintain as small as stock as humanly possible, as little as you can buy, so that you're not left ending that, so that you don't end up holding that parcel with the hand grenade in it. You don't end up with null goods. You don't end up with goods that cannot be sold on, which are expensive to you, which you have spent money on, perhaps even taken out debt on. And that is, a bit of an issue. So you can't just buy as little as needed to meet minimal orders. Defense firms need to buy a large surplus of stock often because it is so difficult to move to, and that's not to sell necessarily, that is to actively move. Anyway, this is really the tip of the iceberg, but this is just for the sort of goods side and for the classical sort of supply chain. If we were to talk about this, we'd probably be here all day, because there are a lot of barriers, there's a lot of issues, and those are challenges to be overcome, and often necessary challenges to overcome. And a lot of defense firms handle this brilliantly. And it's a classical case of, in a lot of industries, people don't know necessarily, I don't really know, what goes on behind the scenes, but what we can know is that it's far more complex than we realize. On the other side of it, beyond sort of classical supply chains, start here, the defense firm is here, and they're selling to the government here, or they're selling to the MOD here. What people don't see is the other side, that firms actually have to get rid of stuff often. Technology that becomes no longer usable, stuff that's classified. I mean, a lot of this stuff is top secret. If they have stuff in development, they have to have certain security parameters. Beyond this sort of conventional supply chain stuff, there is a lot that isn't taken into consideration. Governments have vested interests in certain projects. If something is to pass its, we'll say expiry date, but whatever that might mean in this certain scenario, it can't be used anymore. It's no longer worthy of being integrated. Program's been discontinued, even. They have to deal with that. They've got to move on certain products. They've got to, dispose, dismantle, recycle certain goods. And because of regulation, that often has to be very specific. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, particularly when you're dealing with stuff that can be dangerous, materials that may not be available perhaps to the public. It's got to be done in a very specific way, in line with regulation. And this is just sort of the absolute bare minimum, if you will. So you've got, what is required, and then firms often, in order to be beyond reproach, go above and beyond this. They go a step far beyond. They hold themselves to very high standards with this because, they are held to account by a lot of people. So, really speaking of these high standards, they are not only constrained by government regulation, by a lot of other stuff, which, is necessary. They're held to account by their own standards, their own environmental standards, standards that maybe put in place in order to effectively beat competition, in order to outdo competition, in order to make standards that competition cannot match within the industry. They deal with PR. They've got to ensure they deliver to the public, to the government, to regulatory bodies. Defence firms aren't necessarily just selling to governments. It's not sort of a closed shop. They're making money from public spending, and that's really where it is. It's public spending. They are selling to you and I. They're selling to the taxpayer. They're tasked with making the stuff, or being asked to design something that may potentially be considered, after going through a rather necessary total rigmarole, stuff that defends the entire nation. And this does create an incredibly rigorous and complex process, but it's not as simplistic as some might think. There are a lot of problems, and I've just sort of touched on that today, and not even mentioning their use in commercial markets and how everything is, has to be tracked and logged. As with any other business, they face the problems of, any major government and any major business. Perhaps not any major government, but you sort of see my point. They face more constraint than a lot of other industries might. And so it has to be dealt with a very fine touch. Supply chain management has to be beyond reproach. It has to be ideal. It has to be perfect. So I think I'm going to leave it there, because that's just a bit of an overview. Not to get too into the nitty gritty of the issue perhaps, but just to give a bit of a taste, something to savour. Next, I think I'm probably going to talk about sort of horizontal and vertical integration to help deal with some supply chain problems, as well as maybe sort of an introduction to another defence firm. So I'm going to leave it there today. Thank you.